Imagine yourself in this situation for a moment. You max out all your credit cards to their limits. Then you turn around and lend yourself money to pay off those cards. Sounds like complete financial insanity, doesn't it? If any of us operated with such circular logic, we'd go bankrupt within months, our credit would collapse, and we'd be shut out of the financial system. But this is exactly the essence of how the United States government finances itself today. It borrows billions of dollars by issuing bonds, then buys back a large portion of those bonds through its own central bank, the Federal Reserve. On paper, it looks as if the U.S. is paying itself with money it doesn't have. In reality, this is the biggest financial game the world has ever seen. And this game doesn't just underpin America's own economy, it forms the foundation of the entire global financial system. Everything from oil prices to interest rates in Europe, from investment decisions in Asia to the purchasing power of the money in your pocket, is built on this system. The question is no longer how clever this trick is. The real critical question is this: how much longer can this illusion continue? When will the mirage crack? And when it does, who will pay the bill? To fully understand this complex game, we need to go back to basics, to what a government bond actually is. A government bond is essentially a very simple promissory note, a promise to pay document. When the U.S. Treasury issues a bond, it's essentially giving this message to the buyer: lend me some money now, and I'll pay you back later with interest. Bonds are theoretically considered the safest investment instrument in the world because they're backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. And for more than 2 centuries, that faith has been strong enough. The U.S. government has run budget deficits year after year, spending far more than it collects in taxes, but has always operated with deep confidence that it will find buyers for its next bond issuance. This system actually goes back to the birth of the Republic. When the War of Independence ended in 1783, the young American government was in complete financial chaos. It owed millions of dollars to soldiers who fought in the war, to suppliers who provided ammunition and food, and to foreign powers like France that supported the war. At this critical moment, the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, put forward a revolutionary idea. Hamilton argued that paying off these unpaid old debts with new bonds would actually give the country credibility. And he was right. Young America, having proven it would honor and pay its debts, gained prestige in the eyes of investors and convinced them to lend again. But at the same time, from that moment on, the nation was locked into a permanent cycle of borrowing. Constant borrowing, rolling over old debts with new ones, constantly issuing new bonds. Bonds became an indispensable part of America's financial bloodstream. But the real great transformation came with the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Until that day, the U.S. banking system was in complete chaos. Panics occurred at regular intervals, banks collapsed, and the economy regularly went into crisis. The Federal Reserve was established to stabilize the system and act as a lender of last resort. But over time, the Fed became something more than just an institution that rescued banks. It became almost the most important partner in sustaining the government's debt system. When World War II broke out, this partnership kicked into full gear. The U.S. Treasury needed astronomical amounts of money to finance the war machine. The Federal Reserve intervened and committed to buying government bonds whenever necessary to keep the government's borrowing costs low. This agreement was revolutionary. Now the U.S. had effectively guaranteed demand for its debt. The Federal Reserve could easily buy Treasury bonds by creating money without withdrawing from any savings account. But the system truly gained a global dimension in 1971. Until that date, the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, foreign governments could theoretically exchange their dollars for gold. Every $35 equaled 1 ounce of gold. But in the 1960s, American debt grew due to excessive spending on the Vietnam War and expanding social programs. Requests for dollar-gold exchanges began coming from various parts of the world. As gold reserves at Fort Knox began to dwindle, President Richard Nixon made a historic decision. On August 15, 1971, in front of television cameras, he announced that he was completely ending the gold standard. He separated the dollar from gold, severing the last link with a tangible precious metal. From that moment on, the dollar's value became entirely based on trust. On an abstract concept, on investors' willingness to continue buying U.S. bonds. The system was now entirely built on paper, entirely on faith. There was no physical backing like gold. There was only the belief that America promises to pay. And surprisingly, this was enough. The world continued to believe in the dollar. So how does this system work in daily life today? Let's set aside all the technical jargon and see the simple reality of the mechanism. The U.S. Treasury constantly needs money because the federal government has been spending far more than it collects in taxes for years. With defense, Social Security, Medicare, infrastructure projects, and interest payments, the budget deficit keeps growing. To close this gap, the Treasury periodically issues bonds. These bonds are sold at auction and snapped up by various buyers. Who buys these bonds? Foreign governments like China and Japan are among the biggest customers. Giant pension funds, insurance companies, investment banks, and hedge funds buy them. Investors from all over the world buy these bonds because they're perceived as the safest asset in history. But the most important, most powerful, and most different buyer on this list is someone else. It's the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. And this is exactly where the big trick kicks in. The Federal Reserve doesn't need to collect taxes to buy Treasury bonds. It doesn't need budget approval from Congress. It doesn't need to withdraw money from savings accounts. The Fed uses a much simpler method, digitally, on a computer screen, it simply creates money. Yes, you heard that right. When the Fed decides to buy bonds, it electronically adds numbers to its balance sheet and transfers these newly created funds to the seller's accounts. Money appears out of nothing. Digital entries consisting of zeros and ones. Thus billions of newly created dollars enter the economy. The government borrowed, the Fed bought, the cycle is complete. If you look at it from the outside world, even though it seems like a complete illusion, America is financing itself with invisible money it created out of nothing. This isn't an entirely theoretical process. When you look at the past, you see that this mechanism has been used intensively in every major crisis of the last century. When the 2008 financial collapse occurred, the global economy was on the edge of a cliff. Lehman Brothers had gone bankrupt, banks were failing, credit markets were frozen. The Federal Reserve intervened and launched a program called quantitative easing. It bought trillions of dollars worth of Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. It used the money printing mechanism to the fullest to stabilize the system. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the same game was played on an even larger scale. The economy shut down, millions of people lost their jobs, companies went bankrupt. The government needed trillions of dollars for emergency relief packages, stimulus checks, and unemployment benefits. The Treasury issued bonds, the Fed bought them. One of the biggest money printing operations in history took place. What would have happened without this bond trick? The U.S. government would have had to either multiply taxes or savagely cut public spending. Both were politically completely impossible. No politician could go to their constituents and say, "We're doubling your taxes." So instead, quietly, inconspicuously, relying on its own central bank, it printed the difference. The winners of this game are quite clear. Politicians in Washington can spend as they please without having to directly account to taxpayers. Giant banks and Wall Street investors see liquidity in the markets and constantly rising prices thanks to the Fed's asset purchases. Their portfolios inflate. Foreign governments still continue to hold Treasury bonds as the safest reserve for now. And do you know who pays the cost of this system? You, me, everyone. Although the system looks orderly and stable from the outside, there's a hidden cost: inflation. Every time new money is created to buy bonds, the value of existing money in the economy is diluted. The supply of money increases but the supply of goods and services doesn't increase at the same rate. The result? Prices rise. You pay more at the store, rent goes up, energy bills inflate. Your accumulated savings begin to silently erode. Your wages lag behind inflation. This silent wealth transfer flows from ordinary people on cash and fixed salaries to the elite class who own assets like real estate, stocks, and precious metals whose prices are rising. The second important consequence is structural dependency. The U.S. has been running uninterrupted budget deficits for decades. National debt has reached astronomical levels, exceeded $30 trillion, and continues to grow. This number isn't shrinking, on the contrary, it inflates a bit more every year. Once upon a time, foreign governments eagerly financed America's borrowing. Especially China and Japan stockpiled trillions of dollars worth of Treasury bonds. But in recent years, this appetite has begun to wane. Both countries are gradually reducing their Treasury bond positions. The global balance of confidence is shifting. America's excessive borrowing and constant money printing have begun to make foreign investors nervous. The result? The U.S. is increasingly forced to rely on its own central bank, the Federal. This means more money creation, more inflationary pressure, and much greater fragility when the system loses confidence. The cycle feeds itself. More debt, more Fed purchases, more money printing, more fear of inflation. This situation isn't unique to America. Throughout history, great empires have used debt as a tool to project power and maintain their hegemony. The British Empire financed its navy, colonies, and global power on a mountain of bonds. Throughout the 19th century, sterling was the world's reserve currency and British bonds were the safest investment. Until after World War II, when the devastating cost of the war ended sterling's global dominance. The debt burden became unbearable. It happened just like that. The empire collapsed. Sterling fell from its throne. A more dramatic example is 18th century France. King Louis XIV's ostentatious palaces and endless wars drowned the kingdom in debt. The government tried to keep the system afloat with bond issuance and monetary tricks. But in the end, confidence collapsed, the system exploded, and what followed was the French Revolution. History teaches a clear lesson about this: debt can fuel empires for a while, give them growth and power. But eventually, the trick runs out, confidence melts away, and the system collapses. So how is the U.S. still getting away with this game today? Because it has an extraordinary structural advantage: the American dollar is the world's reserve currency. This concept is very important. Global oil trade is conducted in dollars. International trade is settled in dollars. Central banks in every corner of the world hold a large portion of their reserves as U.S. Treasury bonds. This creates a unique power loop. The U.S. issues debt, the world buys it, and this reinforces dollar dominance. This is a financial empire built not on physical resources like gold or oil, but entirely on trust in American promissory notes. But undeniable cracks have begun to appear. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are trying to develop payment systems independent of the dollar. Central banks are quietly increasing their gold reserves. De-dollarization, the concept of moving away from the dollar, is no longer just a conspiracy theory but the subject of serious economic discussions. If the world one day decides that U.S. debt is no longer the safest bet, the trick could unravel very quickly. So why should you care about this bond trick? Because this isn't a distant, abstract macroeconomic issue. It directly affects your daily life. It affects the numbers in your savings account, the prices at the store, the cost of your mortgage, your retirement plan, your children's future. Every time the government relies on the Federal Reserve to buy its debt, more money is pumped into the economy. Every time new money is created, the dollars in your pocket lose value. If inflation feels like theft, it's because it is. A silent wealth transfer. The fact that the system operates this way has become a structural reality, not a political choice. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. Britain financed its empire on bonds, until confidence collapsed. France drowned in debt, until revolution. Now America is on the same path. Endless borrowing, buying its own debt, the illusion that it can last forever. But every illusion has an end. The only question is when. If this gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. History has all the answers, I'll show you where to look.